So to start off, can you say in your own words who you are and what you do?
My name is Chloe Bass, and I am an artist, a writer, and sometimes a teacher. And I am based in Brooklyn, New York, but currently in St. Louis, Missouri.
So I'd like to start by sort of digging into your approach to research,
Okay.
which uses everyday life as a site for inquiry and really studies like patterns in human intimacy. And so
Mhm.
for those who aren't already familiar with your practice, the Bureau for Self-Recognition was a project that kind of focused on the individual. The book of everyday instruction kind of scaled to duos and couples. And obligation to others holds me in my place is now kind of scaling to families. And I was curious if you could speak to maybe your approach to social engagement as either like a driving force or a means to illustrate your research.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think like one of the things that I understand is that most of the stuff that we do every day sort of goes missing in terms of what we think of as work. And there are these conversations that have opened up around emotional labor, but I actually am not totally thrilled about how they're going. And we can sort of get back to that. But like at least that conversation put into productive understanding that like some of the things that we do normally are work and their work that's kind of within our other work. And also that all of these things in our lives, all of these tiny moments that go missing are really what adds up to being your life. And so I think what I've been interested in doing is not saying like everything about that is valuable, but rather that we should notice and take away things from that, from everyday life and our normal experiences, and use them to interpret some of the larger truths or larger beauties or larger things about the world, because they're not separate from those things. They're kind of like, it's like where the river meets the ocean, and it's like the sort of like salty freshwater kind of situation, right? It's a lot more like that. And trying to figure out what the effect of each thing on the other thing is kind of worthwhile, I think, for anybody, not just for people who like art.
So I first came to your practice via wayfinding, which
Hmm.
should be noted as like a sub-project of obligation to others holds me in my place. And for context, those were like 24 site-specific sculptures that were on display at St. Nicholas Park, and it was presented via Studio Museum of Harlem. And all of the sculptures kind of like use public park wayfinding like structures as sort of like the basis from which you to put your language on. And the three central questions of that show, I'm going to read them off because I want to make sure they're correct.
Okay.
How much of care is patience? How much of life is coping? And how much of love is attention? And I'd love to hear more how you came to that work and why you find it valuable for people to have sort of like these private moments in public spaces.
So the private moments in public spaces thing is actually really based on like me being born and raised in New York and mostly living in New York for my whole life. Like I've traveled and done work in other places, but I've never officially lived anywhere else. But as a New Yorker, like there are these fundamental truths that I believe that are not actually true. So I don't know how to drive a car. Yeah, oops. And
Me
I
too.
also, I believe that everything you can walk to it. It's just not true in other places. And I also understand that a lot of life that is private happens outside of your house because your house is actually really small. And so like you might have need for private space more outside the house than in it because it might not be possible in it. And that's like very normal. Whereas I think that people who are from other places are like, actually, I did have my own room as a kid, but like even still, right, Caribbean mom, you can't shut the door. Like the lock on my door has been broken since 1992, and I don't know if that is true or not. And I'm 36. So, right. So I didn't have a ton of privacy, although I did have a lot of valued introspective time as a kid. And sometimes when you leave the house is when you're like most anonymous. So I like those sort of private moments that exist in or are inspired by or are incidentally connected to public spaces. So doing a project like wayfinding allowed me to materialize some of those feelings and thoughts in an actual public arena, in a public park. So the work came to be because I was approached by Legacy Russell at the Studio Museum in Harlem. She's their associate curator, to do a project. And they have a series called In Harlem, which is public commissions.
So I guess since we're on the topic of that work, how much of love is attention?
A lot, maybe most. But I mean, I think the answer to all of those questions, right? How much of love is attention? A lot, maybe most. How much of care is patience? Like a lot, maybe most. How much of life is coping in 2020? Like all.
All 100%. If it's possible to go over 100, I think that's like what the number is.
Yeah, like 150, 11%. So, you know, I think that the reason I ask those questions is because I have my own hunch about what the answer is, but also, again, that I'm trying to sort of like codify or bring into a sharper relationship these kinds of work that we do that we don't think of, right? Thinking of love as attention doesn't sit well with a lot of people, even if it's true. Thinking of care as patience does sit well, but also like isn't what we think care is necessarily. We think of it as an act, whereas patience is more of like a way of being. It's not an act. It's like a longer thing instead of like a moment thing. And like how much of life is coping is not what we imagine when we think of our lives, but in reality that sign should have just said like adulting.
One thing that I love that comes up again and again in your work is this use of a central question. And it seems to be something that's in performance lectures, in sort of like physical sculptural installations, and also in your essay writing. And I wanted to bring up an essay you wrote in 2016 for Hyperallergic called Can Abstraction Help Us Understand the Value of Black Life? And which you kind of use about the limitations of empathy as an agent for change within the context of America's legacy of state-sanctioned violence against Black folks. And I pulled out sort of like the central question of that was, are abstraction or directness more likely to afford us the understanding we need to move forward? And as a non-Black reader, I was really sort of taken by this call or conclusion you kind of came to at the end, which was sort of asking for an abstraction of listening coupled with the directness of language. And I just thought that was really powerful. And I'm sort of curious, like with navigating this year, with racial uprisings and pandemics, if you're at all revisiting that question or affirming your answers.
The funny thing about that essay, several funny things about that essay. So I wrote it here in St. Louis. And I was here for the first time ever, and I was doing a project, and that's why I was here. And that's actually like not when my partner and I got together, but that is when we met. So like I've been revisiting that time a lot because I'm here again in a totally different way with this person that I met in very different circumstances. Or not very different circumstances, but we have a very different relationship now. And also that essay was written as a result of like specific acts of racialized violence, and also was written in the lead up to an election. So I have every reason to be revisiting that text. That said, I have not read it again at all. So other people have been reading it, and it's been like floating around on Twitter a lot. It kind of resurfaces on Twitter periodically. It's the first thing that I've ever had that I wrote that like seems to lead its own life. And sometimes like comes back to me through other people's feeds, and I'm like, oh, I wrote that, which is cool, right? Which I'm totally flattered by. But I think maybe in a way that's why I haven't read it again, because it is leading its own life. But I still, yeah, what you point to as the central question, like I do stand behind that. And the conversation about empathy, I also stand behind. And I feel that that conversation has now become more mainstream, but in 2016, it really wasn't. And people were really saying like, if we just love each other, this is gonna be fine. Okay, so, right, I come from a family where most people did not partner with, marry, produce children with somebody from their same cultural background. And that's a cool thing about my family. So we have a lot of different types of people, and we do love each other. This is not like my white family's secretly racist story. This is not that story. People get too excited to hear that story. So I just want to be honest, this is not that story. What it is though, is to say that like both of my parents really do not understand each other in a variety of ways. And my dad's brother married a like East Asian woman, an American-born Taiwanese woman, right? And unfortunately, my uncle passed away, but like I don't know how much they always understood each other. My mom's sister, Black Trinidadian woman, married a Nigerian man. I know they didn't usually understand each other, and that's not a problem. We don't need to be the same in order to love somebody, right? We don't need to be the same as the people we love. But I also like further think that we don't need to use this idea that we can feel someone else's feeling in order to have a reason to do the right thing. That just seems very messed up to me. Like, okay, I feel bad that you feel bad, so I'm going to vote or whatever. I'm going to go to this march. No, like, it's the right thing to do. I can't relate to you at all, but I see that this is inhumane. So, like, let's go do something.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of why like that essay really struck me is because I've also found that it's really confusing to sort of like appeal or use someone's like emotions or feelings as a way to like that be the vehicle for them to then maybe change their opinion and
Yeah.
or like pivot on a bigoted stance. Because the thing is that yeah, it's just like there's some things that are like fundamentally right to do for other human beings.
Yeah, totally. And like, if I'm doing it because of feelings change.
Yeah.
So like, okay, the good news is feelings change. The bad news is feelings change. Are you going to undo it when you forget the feeling? We forget our feelings all the time.
Like my feelings also change too depending on like how hungry I am. Like that
Totally.
I can't be banked on feelings alone. So at the end of all these interviews, we're asking every artist to share 3 things that are getting them through the day, and I'm curious what your 3 are.
3 things that are getting me through the days. I mean, like, certainly the debt of gratitude that I owe to my partner, although I am getting him through the days as well, is enormous. And I think that we found a way to like make our life in this moment where we really only hang out with each other for the most part, like kind of pretty fun. I take a lot of walks. So I am lucky because St. Louis is a place that was built to house more people than it has. And so streets and parks are pretty empty, actually, even under normal circumstances. And so during a pandemic, like even more so. So it does not feel at all like a risk to my health to take a walk to a park. And I don't know, like there's so many options for the third thing. We have a cat, that's nice. I always like to have a pet in my life, but I think like the real thing that is getting me through the time is sort of the time itself. Like it keeps filling and carrying us with it. And I appreciate that even when I want it to be a little bit like more restful.